All right, you guys ready to go? I would love to let everyone talk. And did you guys bring like donuts for everybody? Seriously? You guys are awesome. So there's donuts back there. Feel free to get up during my talk and make your way over for refills of donuts. I would let you have a longer break, but we didn't have a time for a break right now, so I'm just going to dive right into it. So let's go. All right. So welcome. Good morning. This is me. Who am I? This is the one slide where I get to talk about myself, and you guys get to figure out why they let me come up here a little bit. If you know me, you probably know me from the documentation. How many people here are native English speakers? Good. All of you are available to be leads on the documentation. You walk into the Symfony community and you start, knocking out with some English slang and things like that, and you can rise right to the top. So for all of you, especially people that are getting into Symfony, that's a good way to do it, and we're really nice. So if you want to contribute, like I said, just having English as your native language kind of puts you up the top there. Let's see here. I also work for KMP Labs. We do a lot of training consulting. That's what I'm going to talk about today a bit. What happens when we travel around many places and train lots of people? What kind of things can we learn about that experience? And for me, most interestingly, is I'm also a writer for KMP University. We have screencasts about teaching PHP and Symfony kind of in a correct way and hopefully not a boring way. And most importantly, is she even here? Is Leanna even in here? Ah, yes. I was going to call you out for hiding for a second, but she's not. And most importantly, I'm the husband of the, as I always say, much more talented Leanna. Raise your hand. She's in the middle. How many of you have not met Leanna yet? Okay, about half. That's actually pretty good, yeah. She's very friendly, so I'm almost surprised that even half of you haven't met her yet. So meet her after this. If you've ever been to any of my talks before, you know that she loves high fives. So we'll keep the tally. Like last conference, how many did you get? You were up at like 25 or something like that, even though it was the last talk of the conference. So find her. Cool. So this is our year so far. Symfony and I have been on many adventures together. We've traveled to over a dozen cities. We've been in 15 different companies. We've seen lots of different things done poorly and done well. Symfony and I have run to catch airplanes. We've rode in cabs together. We rent cars together. Sometimes I drive. Sometimes Symfony lets me sleep in the passenger seat. So it's been a bit of a romance as we've gone to all these different places over the last few months. This is us in California there, enjoying some Mexican. This is us in Burlington, Vermont. Symfony forgot his coat there, as you can see, even though it's very cold. This is us up in Vancouver, traveling as well. So. And we'd like to have a little bit of fun too. So this is actually the first one here from Portland as well. So Symfony and I, we have some adventures, and basically what I'm going to do is talk to you guys all about that today. So first thing, I kind of have a bit of a weird overview of what's happening in some areas of the Symfony community just because I just randomly get invited to lots of interesting companies. So I want to tell you guys the good news and why it's, you all should be happy to be Symfony developers, or if you're Drupal developers, why it's interesting that you're going to be learning parts of Symfony. There we go. First thing, and I'm going to kind of go through this quickly, but this is one of my jobs whenever I have a talk is a little bit of rah of getting all the different communities together. This is something I feel very passionate about. As PHP right now, and it's not because of guys like me necessarily, but guys like Fabian and many other contributors, we're sort of a generation of quality right now, and it's all about quality. Fabian talked about that with his keynote last night, which is sort of interesting. I'll have entire groups that are coming from Java, and I'll say, okay, day one. So tell me what you guys think about PHP. And of course, it's like a joke because everyone starts laughing because they're all coming from object-oriented stuff. But that's really not the case anymore, right? We're doing some amazing things with PHP. In fact, like really best practice stuff. So, and it's about cooperation with things. And I'm not going to talk about Composer. Hopefully, all of you guys know Composer at this point. But this is a really big deal because it means that we're actually going to leverage ourselves as an entire community. If you're at my talk last year at SymfonyLive, I showed a little Google Trends graph that showed PHP way up here. And just for sake of looking at, it was Ruby down here. So kind of like how much are people searching for? PHP, Ruby. Then it did the same thing for Rails. And it switched. Rails up here. And then Symfony, Coding Editor, Zen Framework, even things like Drupal kind of further below. So we have, as a PHP community, are very, very large. And if we can actually work as one unit and separate units, then we can actually be that big. Then I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later as well, but that was kind of my theme of last year, and it's something that I like to harp on as much as possible. Interoperability, I'm not going to talk about this. Again, hopefully most people have heard PHP standards repository. If you haven't, you can go to their site. It's basically where all the PHP warlords come together and they agree on certain things. The last one is the newest thing that they agreed on, and that one's kind of interesting as far as interoperability, because it ended up with interesting things like this. Symfony used to have its own logger interface, and now it uses sort of a PHP standard logger interface. And this is kind of the, Symfony is you can think of Symfony as two things. One, you can think of it as a framework, and a lot of us use it as a framework, or you can think of it as sort of a, as Fabian used the word the other day, middleware, basically these low-level architecture things. And that's why those are the pieces that were brought into the low-level architecture things. Because all the projects, all the PHP web projects, they all solve the same problems like logging. So hey, if we can all use the same logger interface, then life's going to be a lot easier, because no matter who makes a logger, it's going to implement this interface, and we can just use whatever logger that we want. In fact, in kind of a nefarious way, one of the things I dislike in some ways about PHP is when we duplicate effort. We have like 15 logger interfaces. This sort of, when we all implement the same interface, it actually kind of helps that, I think, because it almost seems, it's one thing, it's silly to have 15 loggers. It's even sillier to have 15 loggers that all implement the same interface, aka do the exact same thing all the way down to the method names themselves. Cool, and the last thing, again, is coming back to quality, and I'm going to talk about this briefly, but there's just buzzwords that we're kind of bringing to the greater PHP community. And as groups like Drupal come into our, start learning Symfony more and more, these are really the things, and I just kind of put a couple buzzwords up here. These are really the things that they're learning. It's interfaces, dependency injection, object-oriented stuff, services, and of course, service-oriented architecture is the term that I put up there. So again, these are the kind of like reasons that we should be excited. One, because we're bringing quality, and we're kind of the forefront of bringing that quality out to PHP. Thing number two is Symfony is moving really, really quickly. So as while you're, have your head down working on your Symfony 2.1 application, when you come up for air 6 months later, there's a whole bunch of things that have been put into Symfony. I'm trying to figure out a way, when I was doing this presentation, it's like, how can we quantify this? It's like, how can we figure out, how can I tell people? I could tell them things like this number of pull requests have been merged in this amount of time, or Symfony, Fabian, you had said it's like the fourth most popular or most active project, fourth most active project on all of GitHub in 2012, which is incredible because that's, that's everything, Ruby on Rails, PHP, and everything else. But I thought the easiest way to do is to look at some code. I haven't had any code yet. So this is actually, never seen this before. This has never seen the light of day. This is actually the code that runs the Symfony development process. Does that look about right? So this is 2010, and we've been sort of migrating it since then to kind of to try things out and see basically how far we can push things. 2011, 2012, and then this year we merged a pull request into this, really to get things going. It looks like that now. If you had, more practically, if you actually want to keep up with this stuff, Fabian, assuming you continue not to sleep, Fabian actually has been doing blog posts almost every few days, basically since December of 2012. So you can go all the way back to December 2012. This is on Symfony.com under the blog, under the Living on the Edge section, and it just tells you, they're quick reads. It'll tell you, here's 4 new features, here's the community members that develop them, because the vast majority of the new features are coming from people like you, and here's how to use them, here's why they're awesome. So go ahead and check that out. Cool, and the third reason that it's good to be in Symfony right now is that we're playing on a big stage. And I'm not going to repeat some things that you've already heard. Like you can see some of the other speakers here are rolling Symfony out in very large installations. We see the same thing. We're going to companies where they might actually have 20 different websites, and they're kind of standardizing around Symfony, and like they're doing really, really wonderful things with it. So it's getting brought into a lot of large companies and a lot of large websites because of the quality behind it, because they need to be able to build code bases that are actually going to scale from a performance standpoint and also scale from a quality standpoint. It's also getting brought, of course, into lots of open source projects like this. This is a list that I frantically stole from Fabian when I saw a presentation of his 2 days ago. So this is not an exhaustive list of things that Symfony is getting brought into, but it is several of them. If you want an exhaustive list, you have to talk to Fabian, because he's the one that's going out there and bullying the other lead developers of these projects to get them to actually get to use Symfony, parts of Symfony inside of there. The two that I didn't know about until this week actually were Magento, which has Twig inside of it right now, and then Joomla, which is actually brought in the YAML component. So it's just little things, but you start to see Symfony kind of all over the place in all these different projects, which is really interesting. And of course, Drupal was on that list. And this is very, very important for us. Has anybody wandered over and seen how many Drupal people are over there? And I think some of you are from the Drupal conference. You wandered over the other side? If you have not wandered over to the convention center and kind of on the other side of the exhibit hall, do. It's a circus over there, and I mean that in all the best ways. They have 3,500 people is what Dries said in the keynote. So this is very, very important to us, and it's sort of a dream come true in some ways because our community's gotten so much bigger. And this is a good thing as far as productivity goes, just like all the interesting problems that we're going to be able to solve as a team. Also, they're really, really friendly. I've gotten to know a good amount of people in the Drupal community over the last like 6 months and 12 months, and they're awesome and silly almost to a fault. So they're really, really nice. And of all the communities for us to get kind of thrown next to, that's a really awesome one. Oh yeah, and my bottom thing. And after you hug them, don't let them go, and just hold them like this and tell them about Composer, okay? And the reason is that Drupal people are correctly sort of waiting for Drupal 8, because I don't know what Symfony is, it's sort of on the horizon, it's coming. That's fine. In Drupal 7, in Drupal 6, whatever they have, they can use Composer today to start bringing in external libraries. Most or all of you guys sort of understand that concept, but I don't think they do. Necessarily, because this is all new to them. So tell them about Composer and say, hey man, you can start using these libraries inside of your custom Drupal module today, right now, right during my talk right now. If you're a Drupal person, you can go look this up and start doing it. Cool, so the main event, and this is the bad news, and it's really not bad news, but you have to have some conflict in your presentation, or else it's not as interesting. So I'm going to call this the bad news. And this is sort of the main event. It's sort of, okay, despite all this stuff, why haven't we all retired? Why are we still at a Symfony conference where it's pouring the whole time instead of somewhere south in the sun? Or we're calling 10 lessons from touring like a symphony country music star. And it occurred to me when I put this slide together that the phrase symphony country music star probably never occurred to Fabian that would be somewhere in the world said at one point. So I was happy to coin that. I'm from Nashville, so that's kind of the country thing. Also, if you Google for me, probably he's going to win in the Google results. I have yet to meet him. He's actually from Nashville, I think. Yeah, that is actually not me. I don't know if that's obvious. He's a lot bigger than I am. Cool, number one. And of course, I'm going to be harsh here, but we're going to bring up some important points here. So these are the 10 lessons. Some of them are going to, well, some of them are going to be technical. Some of them are going to be more strategy things. One, the Symfony framework is too hard. What do I mean by that? This right here is what the boot process of Symfony looks like. So if you are familiar with the HTTP kernel, you're sort of like, yeah, okay, this is what it looks like. We have front controller, we have all these things called resolvers. Basically the flow, request comes in, etc., etc. Controller is called, etc., etc. Your page is finished. Because ultimately that's what we do. We have a controller, it's a function, that's where we build our page. This, for Drupal people, this is HTTP kernel from a very, very high level. This is the most fundamental component that's being brought into Drupal. And for people that have looked into this, this is how we would sort of describe it. This is how you describe it on day one of a training when you're brand new to Symfony. It's a lot more confusing than this. I'm actually going to go through some of these. Which part was it? Was it the class not found? Oh, profit, of course. Well, yes. By the end of the training, we always profit. So the Symfony framework is not hard. And part of what I'm going to talk about here actually dovetails perfectly into what Fabian did yesterday morning when he took Symfony and was like, okay, let's actually make this smaller and smaller and smaller and see how small we can make the Symfony framework. So what's going on? Why is it hard? A couple of things I just want to mention that I've seen time and time again when people are new to Symfony. One, it's what I'm going to call like the framework isms. It's the thing that are not specific to that are specific to Symfony. One of the great things about learning Symfony is, for the most part, you're learning about best practices, object-oriented, things that are common to all frameworks. For example, routing and controllers. That is so done by every framework. So it's like, hey, if you learn this in Symfony and you don't end up, you have some other project that's not in Symfony, it's fine. So there's so many great things about learning Symfony because you're just learning how to become a very good web developer. And there are some that are very, very Symfony specific. And these are actually the ones that are sort of the least fun to teach, the least fun to learn, and hang people up. Now I'm going to talk about some of those in a second. Number two, namespaces. Unfortunately, this one's actually a very hard one to debug. For most of you, it's probably not a problem. Once you get it, it's not a problem. When people are learning Symfony, this is a major problem. And I'm not exactly sure if there's anything that we can do about it. I talked to Larry Garfield, the sort of lead guy that's been bringing Symfony into Drupal yesterday about this. But you would not believe the number of errors that this causes new users. Specifically by forgetting the use statement. And if you've done any Symfony development, like kind of modern object-oriented development in PHP, you're sort of like nodding your head. You forget that use statement, what's the error? Class something, something, something not found. And people just stare at that. Because you have to debug that several times before the light bulb starts going on, or starts going off. And then there's some other things, configuration, directory structure, and shortcuts. All these things that when you get into it are not really the most fundamental things that we need people to learn, because we need them to kind of know about routing and then object-oriented stuff, but things that you have to learn. So let's look at a quick example of this. This is what a Symfony controller looks like in many cases. If you use Symfony framework, this is old news. So I'm rendering a template here. It's fine. What I want to do is deconstruct this going backwards. And this is something that we do in the training. So this is the first thing we have people do, because before lunch on the first day, we have to have a page built, or else mutiny and they would throw me out on the street. So we start here. But I don't want people to go here. I want to work backwards. So let's start removing some pieces. A second ago we had just the render function. Now I actually want people to grab a templating service out of the container and call render response on it. And the goal here is I want to, whoever I'm teaching with this, I want to get them closer to what's actually going on behind the scenes. So they're not like, I don't know, he said call a render function. I have no idea what that happens. Let's actually like learn what things we're using. So this is thing number one. Okay, let's actually get a templating service out of the container. Yes, we need to kind of have people understand what a container is. But it's a fairly simple idea at this level, because we're saying there's an object called a templating object. It has useful methods on it. If you want to render a template somewhere, just get that object, and it has a method on it, call it, and life is good. Okay, so this is the next level. We'll go further with this, and this is the one that actually really starts to pay off. And as you can see, though, it's getting longer. I'm getting the templating service out of the container still, and this time instead of calling render response, which I called before, I'm calling render. It's giving me back content, string, HTML, and putting that into a Symfony response object. So this, when people are learning Symfony, this is really what they need to be seeing, because this is really where you start to see Symfony is simple. It's sort of ironic that the more lines of code actually are more explanatory and make things look simpler. You're like, oh, in this case, there's just an object that gives me a string, and then I put that string into a Symfony response object and return it. And that's actually what's happening inside of your controller. And of course, we can take this even further. By the way, these all are actual real code. This last one's kind of BS code. We can even take this further out of the way and say, hey, what's actually happening behind the scenes is we're creating this twig object, and the twig object has a method on it, and it gives you a string back, and you can put in a response object, and you return it. So the challenge with this stuff is, one of these is very good for advertising. So if you're trying to get somebody excited about using Symfony, don't show them that one. Right? Probably don't even show them that one, because you know what? They're going to show you something else, some other framework that looks like that. But if it's for teaching, it's a different situation. Not that you necessarily want to overwhelm them with the last one, but that's eventually where we want people to understand at that particular level. So these are just challenges that we have on a day-to-day basis as we're writing blog posts or Symfony documentation or something else, is basically how to get people to understand things at the level that's really going to make them dangerous without totally terrifying them and making them run away. And by the way, that's true of any framework. That's not unique to Symfony. The thing that's unique to Symfony is the fact that you don't have to call the render function. There's other ways to do it. There's actually smaller pieces beneath the surface. Less well-built frameworks, they have the render function. And if you want to render a template from somewhere else, then you're probably going to have to hack into the framework in some way. This is another one, sort of talking about shortcuts. And just the lesson here is like when you're teaching people, like have them opt into those shortcuts. So how many people, Symfony developers, how many people know that you can use the second syntax when you make a controller? Okay, good. That's not too bad. So you're typically used to seeing like the underscore controller syntax in route. It has a 3-part syntax. This is one of the least popular things when people are starting because it's immediately a Symfonyism. There's kind of a map that says it's to this class, which you can see below. That second line works. So you can actually use that second line because a controller is nothing more than a function. So you can use that second line. That's actually what happens inside Symfony. It sees that first line, and there's just a little bit of code that explodes it into that second line. But the second line there is actually what Symfony wants behind the scenes. It just wants the name of a class and the name of a function. So not that you're actually going to write it that second way, but if you have people in your company or you're showing somebody Symfony, show them that second way because it's like it's just a function. And you use the first way just because you don't want to kill yourself after developing a week in Symfony. Question we got for Cape University was somebody asked, this is John Carey, he's an awesome guy, he's unfortunately not here, asked what the hardest part of doing training is. And it's basically everything that I just told you. It's the first 4 hours, which translates into directory structure, configuration files, people being overwhelmed with the underscore controller syntax, all those types of things. As soon as we have that done, we've built a page, we get to start peeling the pieces away, and by the end of day 1, especially the middle of day 2, people are falling in love with Symfony because they actually see what's going on behind the scenes. So, if you use Symfony Framework, you probably know this, but this is sort of the lesson here. Yell this from a mountaintop. The Symfony Framework is only 2 things. One, it's a routing controller system, request response system. This is sort of the HTTP kernel part. And this is incredibly similar to every other framework. It's very well architected under the hood, but this is the same as everything else. And people will get this after an hour of sitting down with Symfony. So this is cool. So as I tell people after we got through and built our first page, it's like, good, you now know 50% of Symfony. That's it. It's just this, and it's very underwhelming. The second half of it is a bunch of optional objects to help you build your page. If you guys are the Symfony developers out there, you're like, yes, this is the container. The container that has all those objects inside of them. The optional is in orange because this is important to tell people because we want to kind of introduce them to the system piece by piece and be like, if you have the routing and controller stuff down, you don't have to use anything else. If you don't like the forms are too hard, security is too hard, all that stuff is totally optional to you. It's offered to you, but you don't have to use it. So overall, with teaching Symfony, these are all the things I've been saying. The only one that I want to highlight in a little bit is the third one there, which is start small with Silex. This is particularly true as you go and go forth and meet and greet with other non-Symfony Drupal people at this conference, and they are going to say, oh, I've been thinking about looking into that. Have them start with Silex because it has all the right principles and none of the things that are less important initially, like what is config.yaml and what is this underscore controller syntax. Cool. So that was my first long big point here. So lesson number 2 is the Symfony framework is too fat, and this is actually kind of what Fabian was talking about yesterday. I don't actually mean that it's necessarily too fat, but you'll see my point here. So the smaller we make Symfony, Silex being kind of the extreme, the more easily we can make it understandable, and the more easily we can get people to actually understand the concepts. And once you understand the concepts, people can figure out what a configuration file, why it's in this spot or why it's in that spot. So let's create the Symfony on a vegan, no GMO diet edition instead of the Symfony Standard Edition. Symfony Standard Edition looks like this. Well, actually, it looks like this. We're about to make it look like that. So this is usually what your app kernel file looks like. Fabian talked about kernels yesterday. Kernels are, is your way of kind of putting bundles, these features together. So let's get rid of most of them here and make it look like this. And the reason we're doing this is just to start small. What I deleted here, I had like monologue and aesthetic bundle. All these optional features inside Symfony. Aesthetic is a nice library. Monologue is a nice library. But you don't need to use them. And you can always use them later. You can start small and say, basically what this next slide gives you, I've actually kept some stuff in here. This gives you the routing controller layer, which is basically framework bundle that gives you some other things. I've even kept Doctrine. I've even kept Twig so I can render templates. So this is by no means a system that's not real and you couldn't actually build a website with. I can do a lot of damage with this system. I've just removed some of the outside things. So back to talking about like what the Symfony framework is, it's the routing controller layer, it's the DI, dependency injection service container full of useful objects, and it's a bunch of optional shortcuts. So by removing those bundles, what we did with the second and third thing was basically we have less of those. Not that having a million services in your container is bad for performance or something, but there's something refreshing about knowing that our container used to have 100 services in it, now it has 40 services in it. And that's actually what I'm going to take to my team, and we're actually going to start developing on that. 2 weeks from now, we may choose to add the monologue bundle. And when we do, there's all of a sudden going to be a logger service. There's something nice about having that, making that choice and saying, see how we plug the monologue bundle in here and see how that gives us a logger service. It's like, oh yes, I can sort of see the individual pieces working here. This also, I'm going to talk about the timeline in a second. This also is going to remove a bunch of event listeners from the timeline. So in Symfony's timeline, you can basically see all the different pieces that are happening inside Symfony. You remove a lot of those bundles, a lot of those are going to go away. So as far as the number of things going on that you may or may not know about or even be using, this minimizes them. You can opt into them later. Cool. So lesson number 3, and this is going to start getting into a little bit more of some technical things here in the middle. The timeline, that's what I was just talking about. The timeline is a feature new to Symfony 2.1, so it's been around for a while now. It's absolutely awesome, and it will be, right, Fabian? Because this should be in the available in Drupal. This should be available in Drupal because Drupal is using all the same underlying components. So that's something that Fabian is probably working on right now to get that in there. So if you're a Drupal person and you're like, what is this? This actually shows you what's happening in every part of your request and how long things are taking. It's good for 2 reasons. 1, understanding what's going on, and 2, obviously, its sort of purpose, which is performance, which is how long are different things taking. So this is a page, not a necessarily particularly fast page, taking 700 milliseconds, except it's actually taking 800 milliseconds because I have this 100 milliseconds of initialization time. So I have this big colored graph down here of what's actually happening, and then I have this 100 milliseconds of sort of black box time. Does anybody know, how many people know what the initialization time is? Hugo, yeah. Oh, a couple of people. So this is what it is. It's basically, Fabian talked about the kernel yesterday, the kernel booting. That's one of the things you can do. You can create your kernel and say boot. And what that does is it boots your bundles, which actually basically means nothing in a practical sense. And it builds your container. So specifically, this is, again, the initialization time. We're talking about is booting the bundles, which probably doesn't take very much time unless you actually have a boot function in one of your bundles that's doing something insane, which is highly, highly unlikely. And then it decides if it needs to rebuild the container. This is not the step where it's actually doing the rebuilding. This is actually the step to see, based on the last modified times of different configuration files, whether or not the container, which is statically compiled, needs to actually be rebuilt. This is an interesting one. It does not affect you in production because your container is not built in production, obviously. You just build it once. But this is something that as a project gets bigger, it can actually take more and more time in development. So if you see your initialization time starting to grow, this might be the reason why. And of course, building the container, this is one that drastically is different based on your project. This is, again, not another one that you need to worry about in the production environment, but this is the one that sometimes takes a lot of time. And then this is the one I like down here, instantiating the container. So the top one and the bottom one are the only ones that you need to worry about in the production environment where your container is not rebuilt, and they're super, super, super fast. That bottom one, more or less, as your container gets bigger, it's not going to slow down. The actual initiation, the instantiation step of that is not going to slow down significantly. So if you do see your initialization time getting longer, don't panic. It's probably only in the dev environment. You might want to double check that by putting some temporary debug code in that class. But it's probably okay. I've seen initialization times go up and people are kind of panicking, and it's not that big of a deal. I've also seen initialization times go up tremendously on servers that had bad NFS mounting problems, where they were actually caching over here and the system was getting confused with last modified dates, and it was constantly rebuilding the container, and when it was statting things to see what their last modified date is, it was happening over a network. So if you see initialization time going very high and you do have some sort of setup like that, it's a good chance that you have some sort of weird network mount type of thing. Cool, next one. And this one actually is a problem. So the first one, probably not a problem. You have to double check. This one could be a problem. So kernel.request.loading. So above it, see kernel.request. This is the amount of time it takes for all the listeners to the kernel.request event to do their thing. See, in this particular example, kernel.request.loading is taking up the vast majority of the time. My listeners, the individual listeners, they're actually executing quite fast. So what is kernel.request.loading? How many people know what's inside of that? Probably more than that. Staring at you, Igor. I was like, I bet Igor knows. What's that? I'm tired. How late did you stay out? Just kidding. All right. I was like, you don't have to answer that. I won't incriminate you. So this is the amount of time it takes to instantiate the listeners, the objects that are ultimately listeners to the kernel.request event. And by the way, there's one of these for every event. There's a kernel.response event, so there's a kernel.response.loading part of the timeline. We don't normally think about how long does it take to instantiate something. We think about, okay, this function is going to be called, let me make this function efficient, but we don't think about the constructor taking a lot of time. And typically, and that's for a reason, one thing you should never do in your constructor is work. Your constructor should be, let's say you have 3 arguments to your constructor, you should just be storing those for later. Never doing any work, because you may not need to do that work. But still, even though this project here is actually architected well, the constructor is taking a lot of time. And to debug this, and I'll talk about this in a second, it's a little bit difficult. This is the events tab of the profiler to show you all the listeners that are happening. And you see one of the buttons called the locked out log out listener, which is, in this particular project is just a listener that does a very simple thing. It looks on the user record of the current user to see if they've been locked out, and if it is, it logs them out. So it's something that's run on like every 1 millionth request, or is important on every 1 millionth request. But of course, that little hook to make that check is run on every request. This right here, how many people are familiar with this screen? A few people, not as many people as I'd probably like. Not that you need to necessarily be digging for this complexity. This is from the JMS debugging bundle. It's not a core bundle. It's a very nice bundle that you can install into your project. What it does is it shows you sort of the graph of your dependencies, meaning if I have my service right there in the upper left, that's the logout listener, what are its dependencies? And you can even click to some other ones off of it and say, what are its dependencies? What ends up happening, and it's very difficult to debug, and this is where this performance thing comes from, is that we have a thing where when I instantiate service A, it actually needs to instantiate these other 5 services because they're dependencies. And those all have their own dependencies, and those all have their own dependencies. So whereas I think, hey, I'm going to ask the service container for this one service, depending on how your application is architected, you could instantiate that, and behind the scenes might instantiate 100 objects. And it's sort of death by 1,000 cuts, because if you actually did have to instantiate 100 objects just to see whether or not the user's little locked out column in the database was checked and on, then you're basically slowing your application down quite a bit. So you have to be careful with these listeners and sort of the weight of their dependencies. And in this case, that's a perfect example. You can see it's dependent on all these different things. The fact that the locked out logout listener is dependent on the translator is a little bit insane. So on every request, the translator is actually being instantiated at a very early time just to figure this out. So architecture problem. Solution. Now I'm going to show this a little bit later as well. One, inject the container. That's the kind of stuff that gets you sort of thrown off stage. But in some cases, you will need to inject the container. It doesn't mean you have to write bad code after that. But if you inject the container, set that as a property, then you can grab the services out of it later in a lazy fashion. So inject a container so that instantiating your object is very simple. And then only later in your method where you're doing the work, decide that you need to get the translator out. And then only get it out then. Because, of course, it's only going to be instantiated in that case once we actually ask for it. And then this is a new feature. It's called Lazy Services. It's new to Symfony 2.3. It integrates with a nice external bundle to offer this for you. It's called Proxies. I'm not going to talk about it. We already have documentation on it. So if you go to Symfony.com and you hit the little version selector and go down to Symfony 2.3, you can look up Lazy Services. And basically what that's going to be is it means that your objects are going to look like they did before, where you're injecting things just the way you want to, except you're getting kind of a Frankenstein object. There's basically some trickery going on behind the scenes, which ultimately means that you can still have your code look the way it did before, but you're not going to pay this price of having to create all these objects up front just to do that. So the trickiest part about this stuff and where you're going to find this, it's very hard to find. You're going to find it in the loading things, like kernel request loading, probably that one more than any other one. You're going to find it in your firewall, which is actually another one of those keys, and you're going to find it in your controller. So when you look at your timeline, it's those 3 areas that are going to expand, and you're going to be like, why are those expanding? It's very difficult to debug, because if you ask for service A, maybe service A is only actually dependent on one other service. You're like, not a problem. But then, of course, it is dependent on 2 services, and those 2 services are dependent on 2 more services. So it's a little bit difficult to debug exactly where your heaviness is coming from. And the tricky thing is it's okay to have 1,000 services in your container. It's just not okay that when you ask for one, all 1,000 are instantiated. So just be careful with that. When you do get on Symfony 2.3, this will get easier to debug, because if you think that a service is causing a problem, you can actually just make that a lazily loaded service, which is just going to be a little configuration option in like a services.yaml file. Refresh your page, look at the timeline, and did that help or not. Cool. Next thing. Chris talked about this yesterday, ACLs. How many people use Symfony's ACLs? There was like 3 hands or so, which was exactly 3 more hands than I expected. So here's the trick here. Very simple situation. How do I enforce that a comment can only be edited by its owner or somebody that's a super admin? Okay? So this is Symfony's access control list, part of the security component. And basically what it does is it creates a sort of new table. And in that table, it stores that this object and this user have sort of this connection, meaning that this user can edit or view or delete or is an owner, meaning they can do anything to this object. Okay? It's very, very efficient. It's very, very flexible. And I don't think that you should use it. Probably. Okay? And actually, Chris said the same thing yesterday, Chris Walsmith, when he was up here, for the same reason that I'm going to say it as well. So the relationship between the comment and the user is already established in your system. I guarantee it. You have a comment, it probably has a user property on it to store that relationship. So with forgetting about security and all that kind of stuff, if I dropped you guys into a file, you could write very few lines of PHP code to figure out whether or not the user should have access, this comment and this user should have access to edit each other. So one is if the comment get user is the current user, access granted. If the current user has, let's say you just invent some role like role superadmin, access granted, otherwise access denied. Dead simple stuff. ACLs are very, very complex. This is not a complex situation. ACLs are overkill. So let's do something much easier. Chris mentioned this yesterday about the idea of voters. I'm glad he did, so it means I don't have to go into as much detail about it. This is probably what your code looks like in your controllers. If you're using Symfony, you get the security context service, which has more or less just one interesting method on it called isGranted. Now, most of the time, you guys probably are passing something here like role user or role superadmin, role admin, or things like that. You can just invent whatever you want there. I'm going to talk about that in a second. Also notice I'm passing a second argument there, which is the blog object itself, which is probably something that, if you're not using ACLs, is probably something that you haven't seen too much of either. So what happens behind the scenes here, and Chris mentioned this yesterday, is this goes out to a group of voters, just objects that are sitting in the system, and based on that edit and that blog object, it says, hey, can you decide whether or not the current user has access to edit this blog object? And it will either say they do have access, they don't have access, or I have no opinion on the matter. Okay, so it goes across all the voters asking for this. And as you can see, the second argument, you can pass it an object. That's not something you normally do, but that object is going to get passed to each voter. Now, these are the core voters that are inside Symfony by default, and you guys will recognize what these do. The role voter is the voter that's just looking for, if you pass it like is granted anything role underscore something else, that voter says, I know how to vote on that, and it's going to say, it's going to decide whether or not you have access to it. That's actually the reason why you have to have roles that start with role underscore by default. It doesn't start with role underscore, that voter just doesn't vote. So it doesn't give you access, it doesn't deny access. The role hierarchy voter, it's a similar one. That's the role hierarchy in security.yaml. Basically, it's a very similar thing. It's trying to see if this user has a particular role. And then the authenticated voter, that's the guy that takes care of the is underscore authenticated underscore things. And this is all about how trusted are you. So it's a totally different voter. If it starts with that, it votes. And then it looks to see, hey, is the user authenticated as remember me, or do they authenticate on this request? And it returns true or false based on that. So this is actually what's happening behind the scenes, one called the isGranted function right now inside of our application. Notice that none of these have anything to do with an object. It's all a global thing. Does the user globally have a role underscore admin role? How authenticated are they globally, not with respect to a particular object? So what we're going to want to add once we start looking at this comment problem is actually passing an object there and having our own voter to take care of that. So this is what a voter looks like, and I'm not going to go over all the details in here. But the two methods that I have up here, as you can see, it implements a voter interface, which is going to require you to have 3 methods. These first two methods is basically one where you invent some attribute or attributes that you're going to be able to ask on. So I just invented the word edit. I was like, I don't know, I guess it'll be useful in controllers to be able to run around and say, can I edit a comment? Okay? So I just made up edit right there, and then in my voter I said, yes, when somebody asks about the edit thing and is granted, I am able to take care of that. So please ask me my opinion in that matter. And same thing down here for the object. So this basically here is a fancy way of saying when there's a comment object being passed, I actually want to be opinionated and vote on that. Okay? And then the third method of the interface is just the vote interface. And this is awesome because basically this is just where we're going to have our business logic to do whatever very simple logic we need to do to enforce access or not. The comment object is going to be passed to it, and attributes is actually going to be an array containing the string edit. That's one of the tricky things or weird or very flexible things about voters is the isGranted function, that first argument, can actually be an array of strings. We usually say your role_admin actually be an array of things. The tricky part is that whatever voter votes on that, that's where you'd actually have the logic to be like, what does an array mean? Is an array and logic? Is it or logic? Do you have all of these things? Typically for me, to make it simple, I just have it be just the string. One string, and so even though that is an array of attributes, I'm going to be expecting it just to have like one attribute on there. Cool. The only tricky part about here, this is business logic. This is the same simple business logic we were talking about earlier. It takes like 6 lines, and that's it. And this is what you want to do when you have to do your own access control. The only tricky part I will mention, so put it in the back of your head, is that even though we made these pretty methods here a second ago, these ones, these are not actually called by Symfony. So even if these methods return false, the vote method will be called on your voter. So it's basically your responsibility up there where I have a comment to actually go and call your supports attribute and your supports class method and be like, am I supposed to be voting on this or not? Don't expect Symfony to call that for you and then not call your vote function. Other than that, it's just business logic. Cool. And the only thing I want to highlight here is these classes are very simple. You can unit test them, which is probably important for security. And ultimately, this is the most important thing, going back to like service-oriented architecture, keeping our controllers skinny. This is how you want your authorization lines to look. You do not want to have in a controller somewhere this big if is granted this, else is the user equal to that. That's stuff you want to put in here so that you use it globally and actually unit test it and have this one spot. So in my opinion, the authorization should always be a single line. And if it's something more complex, well, it's like, well, what if the user has this or this? You need to make up something new and have a voter actually vote on those conditions. You've got to centralize the security stuff. Last thing I'll mention is security implications of this. This is another gotcha I've seen. Earlier we saw the kernel request loading get longer. The firewall can also get long. When the firewall runs, the firewall is just a listener. But when the firewall runs, Chris talked yesterday about these things called authentication listeners. When the firewall runs, all these objects get instantiated. All of your authentication listeners get instantiated. So they need to be very lightweight in their constructors. Also, your voters are instantiated, which is a funny thing because the voters, any particular voter may or may not actually vote on this particular request. It may not actually even need to be instantiated, but it will be instantiated as part of the firewall. So you need to especially make sure that your voters are very lightweight. And this is what I was talking about earlier. The cheapest and easiest way to do this, even though it looks ugly here, is to inject the container and then actually get your heavy service out of the container later. Don't run around doing this. This is not a great practice. You just pick this out when it's important. If you see that firewall getting longer and you know you have custom voters, check this out because this is a good chance that this is actually what's causing your firewall to sort of expand. You won't see that. The timeline's not going to tell you that specifically. Yeah, or use the proxy lazy and proxy services. Cool. Let's see here. Good. I'm running out of time, but that's okay because most of the technical stuff is behind us. Last thing I want to talk about on the technical thing, and then I'm going to wrap up, because this is one of my favorite things to teach, and it's one of the most important things. It's form variables. So sorry, I'm going to take like 5 more minutes. How many people are familiar with form variables? Good, good. It was it was more than I was expecting, which is good. So this is what a form looks like. We're going to find out who our favorite developers are. Okay, and this is creating a form in the controller. We're running it in a template. Very, very simple, straightforward stuff. This is how that usually looks inside of your template to actually render it. Cool? Perfect, straightforward. So behind the scenes, there's things called form variables, which are actually what drive what all the markup looks like when you're rendering your form. And you can find out what it is. You can get access to the variables for any particular field by saying form.name.vars or form.email.vars, whatever your name is. And if you use the twig dump function, it's actually going to dump all that stuff out for you. So what you see here is the variables embedded in that field, and these are 100% of the things that go into rendering that field. The form functions like form_row and form_widget, those all typically have a second argument, sometimes a third argument, which is an array of variables that you can pass when rendering it to override those. So all of a sudden, this is a big giant menu of things that you can override when you're rendering any individual field. So even if I hadn't written any documentation or read any documentation, as soon as I do that dump, I know that when I call the form row function, for example, I can pass these as the second argument. Be like, I'm going to override the label, I'm going to override the value. So that's a kind of a non-traditional thing. Override the value in there, override the label, ATTR, and anything else that I want to. Anything that was in that list, because that's what's being used to render it. Heck, let's go simpler with this, because that's what the whole theme of this is. Like, let's go easier, easier, easier. There's lots of great tools in Symfony. Doesn't mean you need to use all of them all at once. So let's render the field by itself. So forget the form functions. If things get tough, just use the form variables. Dump it out, see what's on there. This is me rendering the whole darn thing just by using those form variables. So form.name.vars.full_name. That's actually the full name. You use as a name attribute. Errors, use everything you can get off of here. So feel empowered to do this when things get difficult. It's totally okay. And when you're form theming, for people that have done form theming, that's the other one of the questions. So if you're actually customizing what a form row looks like on a global level, you end up in a little block like this. And the only tricky part about this is, once again, all of a sudden you have these variables. Like you have this, if you look at the core Symfony code, you have an errors variable and a required variable and a label ATTR variable. And you're like, where are these coming from? Once you're inside here, if you know what variables you have available to you, you can use them to actually customize things very easily. How do we do that? The dump function. Once again, use Twig's dump function inside your block and pass it no arguments, and it's going to dump out all variables that are in your current scope. And bam, you are dangerous because you have access to everything up here and you can do whatever you want. Cool. Tip number 6, and we don't go into this one too much, is HTTP kernel. The thing that's going to separate the leaders, the absolute leaders when you're developing in Symfony, understanding of this component, basically. This is the component that's brought into Drupal. It's not the only component, but it's the most important one. So if you have not gotten intimately familiar with this, then you have some homework. There's 2 good ways to learn about this. One, probably the best one, is Fabian's blog post on the blog series about this. It's 12 parts. Go through it. It's all about building things from the ground up using high-quality components to actually figure out what's going on. We also have an HTTP kernel component document, which is also quite good. It's a little bit higher level, but you can get into what's actually going on behind the scenes. Cool. Let's see here. I'm running low on time, so I'm going to skip through part of this. You can come after. I'll post these online, but you can come after as well if you want to talk about this. How many people have done HTTP caching and ESI stuff? Okay, decent number. Here's basically my lessons to you. One is use them. That syntax up there should look fairly familiar. This is the way that you would embed a controller inside of a template. For Drupal people, this is one of the biggest reasons that the HTTP kernel component was brought into Drupal. It's because it allows your page to be rendered actually not as one page, but many different small little pieces. So don't think of one page anymore. Think of many different small little pieces. Let's see here. And the only tricky part about this whole thing called ESI, and I know I'm rushing through this, is it breaks, when you use ESI, what it means is it basically breaks things down in different pieces. Our application doesn't return a whole HTML page anymore. It returns an HTML page with holes. And those holes look like that. Okay? So where there normally was this big blog post, there's now this tag. But you never see that. Because as the request comes in, we have this caching layer in the center. Request comes in, it passes through this caching layer, it comes back from our application, and our application, again, has just generated a page with a hole in the middle of it, with this thing. This hits that cache layer, the cache layer parses that out, sends another request back to our application, which renders just that one part, and then puts it all together. Okay, so hopefully most of you have kind of seen the ESI kind of caching flow. If you haven't, Fabian has some presentations on that as well. What I want to point out is what makes this difficult for people to learn is the fact that you can't see that happening. By the time you get here, us, the browser, even us as developers can't tell what just happened. we're like, I don't know, I see a whole HTML page. There was 5 things happening behind the scenes. Where are these ESI tags? You never see the ESI tags because they're sort of digested before it ever gets to us. So the key to this is, and if you read the HTTP caching chapter in the documentation, we mentioned this, is if you're using Symfony's app cache layer, it's that guy. This is your secret to knowing what's going on at the caching layer. And I said, this stuff is not hard. Use it. Use ESI. And when you do, go to your network tab for your page and look for the X Symfony cache header. What it's going to tell you is that there was a main page here and that it was a cache miss because you're not caching it. And then here, the big long URL below that is that there was also an ESI fragment. So it was broken into 2 pieces, and the ESI fragment went, and it actually was fresh. It actually got that out of the cache. So it's the only way that you're going to be able to see what's happening inside that middle layer. It also means you can actually just copy those URLs. So if you actually want to see your application rendering just that fragment, you can just copy that URL into your browser, and that's going to give you just the fragment. So let's say that fragment is like a sidebar we're caching. You can just copy that URL and actually go and see your application just run the sidebar. You can debug things that way or see how that's caching on its own. And that's what, as far as messages go, you saw miss and fresh before. You also see things like stale and valid store. That's the most common one. This is almost a log of what's happening in that middle layer. Stale means that it was stale in the cache, and valid means it went back and got a new version of the cache, and store means that it stored it in cache after that. And I'm totally out of time, so... Oh, this is one of my favorite slides. Hold on, it's coming. Oh. This actually goes right into my conclusion anyways. There we go. So the few slides that I went past there, and I'm sorry that I packed too many things in, but we got through like all the technical stuff, was with these 2 communities together. We're over on this side of the building, they're over on that side of the building. We're using each other. And the 4 bits of homework basically are, as you're teaching people to learn Symfony or you're talking with Drupal people, remove the layers, get down to the basics, because it's all about services and good OO practices. That's what's tripping people up, not the Symfony for everything. So focus on those things. Thing number 2, related to that, emphasize the service-oriented architecture over Symfony. We need people to kind of get the philosophy of why we create services. Rather than once you use Symfony. One of the slides that we passed on is I basically said, if you get this part right, I don't care if you use cake PHP. Use whatever you want. Symfony kind of pushes you into good practices, but this is the most important thing. Third one is challenge Symfony. And what I mean by that is we have been stable for about 2 years now, but when you're using Symfony, be looking out for things. How can we make the documentation better, the error messages? Challenge us. How is the documentation on the bundle you're using? Did you figure something out? And what it comes down to is sharing your solutions, both within the Symfony community and within the Drupal community. Share things so we all have great tools together. And finally, and this is will not surprise you if you know me, last piece of homework is to sit with a Drupal person at lunch today and tell them about Composer. Sit with a Drupal person at lunch today, introduce yourselves, and basically start putting those 2 communities together. Our community just got 10 times larger, and that's wonderful. We're over on this side of the building. They're over on that side of the building. So bridge the gap a little bit and kind of be that person. We're a scarier technology probably than they are, so don't expect them to necessarily come up to you. Come up to them and introduce yourself. And that is it, and I'm way over time, and I apologize. There we go. And we love you. And there's my joined in thing right there. And also, Camp University, you can get a free screencast. Anybody here? Coupon code HIPSTER, give you a free screencast to check that out. And thank you very much.